We're joined in studio by Professor Patrick Bond. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Johannesburg. Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Perhaps let's start with this Trump case. I want you to talk about just how unprecedented the situation is. He is the first president to be indicted, and in his case, twice. And these charges are very serious because they are federal charges.
Yes, they are, and there may be even more serious charges associated with whether he instigated a coup attempt, in a sense, on January 6, 2021, and also the extent to which in his own corporate dealings in his Trump corporation, there were just overwhelming illegalities, especially in valuation of property. So those three, and there's a Georgia election in which he interfered and tried to get votes recounted. So yeah, a series of legal battles ahead for him over the next year and a half. He probably will be now, it's fairly clear with the boost in popularity in his own party, the nominee from the Republicans. And in this battle that we saw in 2020 between Biden and Trump, the rematch is going to be even more fierce.
And now, despite the indictment, despite these charges being so serious, we are hearing reports that he is actually, as you're saying, gaining favorability, amongst his supporters, and that of Biden is declining. And despite this, is it because he's managed to convince his supporters that this is nothing but a political witch hunt, even though we're hearing that if he is convicted, he could face up to 100 years in jail?
Well, all of these, let's say they're partly procedural questions of where were the papers, and you see them in the loo, and you see them in the stage of a ballroom, and so that looks to many people that, okay, he's really careless, but is that the basis for putting him in jail? And that was, in a sense, the supporters feeling that this is a political hit job and it's way overboard, given that Biden himself had left some of his papers in his garage. He sort of said, no, I put them next to my supercar, and so they were all locked up. And you can see in a way and also Hillary Clinton had emails when in 2016, that was one of the reasons she lost the presidency against Trump. So procedure, let's say, is taken quite seriously. Would he go to jail? Yes. Could he rule from jail? Yes. That's the ironic thing, that you can actually, as one, I think 100 years ago, a socialist candidate for the US president actually ran a campaign for president, and he didn't win, but it wasn't impossible.
That was actually going to be my question. Now that we know that this trial could possibly run until after the elections, what does it then mean for his political ambitions and the fact that he wants to campaign for president?
Well, in South Africa, where we don't have such a rabid right wing, we may be used to have a hardcore Afrikaner pro-apartheid, or we may have some kind of Trump supporters in Western Cape, Brexit type of politics. We really don't see anything, do we, here that would give us any sense of the rabid character of right-wing populism. It's racism, homophobia, there's a culture war that keeps playing out. And that's why, if for some reason Trump does find himself unable to run for president as a criminal, it's just too embarrassing, there is somebody in the wings, Ron DeSantis. And so DeSantis, plus a lot of the other right-wingers, including the leader of the House of Representatives, the second chamber of their parliament, Kevin McCarthy, they're really coming out in support of him. On the other hand, the top layer in the Senate and the sort of more establishment Republicans are appalled. And so one of them, the former leader of the Senate, Mitch McCarthy, said, no, this is not, well, he's not saying anything, and that tells you a lot.
Prof, I want us to stay in the US, but bringing in another matter. I want us to talk about the AGOA matter, and of course that is the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. We now know that there is this letter, 4 US congressmen, very powerful in their position, urging Biden to move this year's AGOA forum from South Africa because of South Africa's stance on Russia and the Ukraine war. How much of this should we read into it?
Well, because there's one African American leader in the lower house of the parliament, the House of Representatives, Gregory Meeks, who last year was running the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So he's sort of the central legislator that deals with foreign affairs. And he has regularly called South Africa out, his main concern being the Wagner Group all over Africa. We see it now with Sudan and the rebel group being supported by Wagner forces. So Russia's connections to Africa is as an African American leader of the Congressional Black Caucus, that's an important figure not to alienate. And then there are Republicans, and in the Senate they're not that powerful. I think those 4 guys have just sent a letter to Anthony Blinken saying, let's see if we can get South Africa not to host AGOA in December. It was meant to be in September, but that was so close to BRICS that by mutual agreement, let's move it to December. And now let's move it out of South Africa is their pitch. I don't think they're going to win, because I think what Durko has done, the Foreign Affairs Ministry, has said, we'll play it cool. It's just a letter from 4 members of their Congress. It's not like Joe Biden has to act on that, or Tony Blinken has to actually move AGOA. And then you'd say, well, maybe AGOA won't be renewed in 2025 when it runs out, especially for South Africa, seen to be favoring Russia in this awful conflict in Ukraine.
I mean, on the one hand, a lot of people saying that Americans are being bullies, that this is actually a country that can manage its own affairs. But on the other hand, there is that seriousness of what it would mean for AGOA, which was never meant to be something that is, within our reach for this long. What it would mean in essence, in terms of growth for this country.
Well, we have to ask then who would win and lose if AGOA is actually discontinued. For South Africa, it's due to expire in 2025. That's 25 years after it began. And South Africa, Angola, Nigeria, the other 2 mostly with oil, but for South Africa, aluminium and steel and petrochemicals, some other minerals and automobiles, those would be hard hit. And it's there's some silver lining potential. If there is less production, then we'll have less revenues and maybe less taxes. On the other hand, we'll have a lot more energy, because those are the main guzzlers, the smelters, the auto factories. So here we get to the big question: can we get into a just transition as fast as we can, in case many of those exports go down for geopolitical reasons? But they may also go down because, if Trump comes back in 2024, that's right-wing protectionist imperialism, right? That's the sort of politics that had Trump already in 2018 cutting South Africa's aluminium and steel imports into the U.S. just without any good reason. It wasn't to do with AGOA. It was just because he was trying to protect a certain constituency of blue collar workers that he had sort of promised to save their jobs.
And I'm glad you brought the Trump link back, because there is that possibility that he could be re-elected. Slight possibility, but some are talking about it. But Prof, you mentioned BRICS. All right, there is of course this whole cloud over South Africa in terms of what will the country do. Will BRICS be held in South Africa in August? And more importantly, what is their stance on Putin?
It's partly on Putin, and then there's a longer term question that really would irritate the US. One of the key senators, Marco Rubio, had made a very clear point. If the BRICS lead a de-dollarization, in other words, to break US dollar hegemony, then we can't do sanctions anymore. This is a sort of famous right-wing senator. And I would watch that tendency, because it is the sort of fear and a geopolitical tension as the US goes into decline, that China, Russia, and now not just 3 others, South Africa, Brazil, and India, but maybe 20 others, maybe Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Turkey, even Thailand and Indonesia, and states, Nigeria, Algeria, Argentina, maybe Mexico. These are states that have had long-term relationships, some of them, like Saudi Arabia, very close to the US. And if South Africa is seen to be pushing this expansion of the BRICS and really working against the US and maybe de-dollarization, I think it's mainly a myth, but if that happens, that's the sort of political signaling that could be bad for South Africa's role in AGOA.
And of course, we know that South Africa wants to also push this peace-keeping front, delegates being sent to Russia and then again to Ukraine. Just as a final question from my end, are US and SA relations under threat? I mean, we've heard some political parties within the country obviously being very frightened in terms of what is happening in South Africa, not being very clear about its stance in the war in Ukraine. Just talk to us about the relations between US and SA just going forward, particularly in light of what is currently happening.
Sure, and we've seen visits by military personnel recently that were controversial from South Africa to Russia. We saw the military exercises in February off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal. And we've seen the Lady R controversy, which we still don't have any sense. Were weapons loaded, as the US State Department claims? Very, very low credibility of the US State Department given its false claims in the past. or was it just some unloading that occurred? And those are really tough questions, because whether or not Cyril Ramaphosa and the other African leaders make any inroads into some terrain, it really doesn't seem that the tragic war is ripe in a sense for peacekeeping. And even though Ramaphosa's had some experience, Northern Ireland, where I was born, that's a fantastic feather in his cap as a negotiator, it may well be impossible to see him work his way out, no matter what a skilled politician he is. And that would mean, yes, the US would feel their long-term friend since Mandela, South Africa, has leaned too far, and the BRICS hosting, if it's here, would confirm that. On the other hand, if it goes to China, it may be that tensions will simmer.
Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.